the Voices of VR podcast, and I'm really happy to be here at the Gatherverse today talking about sensemaking frameworks for the Metaverse and XR ethics. It's the first time I've got the chance to talk about the Metaverse, and this is how I start to think about what it is and where it's going and how to think about it from a lens of XR ethics. So I'm going to be talking about a number of different things today, including a survey of the metaverse landscape, looking at the value of pluralism, looking at the experience economy and experiential design. Virtual reality is something that is the ground for me for how I start to think about the future of the metaverse. Then looking at XR privacy dilemmas, context and rights. And the last four sections I'm going to be talking about the impact of these big companies, everything from the laws and culture, skewed demographics, and then the need for responsible innovation and the tech pacing gap challenges. So let's do a survey of the metaverse. So Tim Sweeney at the SIGGRAPH 2019 talking a lot about the open metaverse as a real-time 3D social medium where people can create, engage, and shared experiences as equal participants in an economy with social impact. So Matthew Ball has been writing a number of different essays over the last couple of years. His definition is that the metaverse is a massively scaled and interoperable network of real-time rendered 3D virtual worlds which can be experienced synchronously and persistently by an effectively unlimited number of users with an individual sense of presence and with continuity of data such as identity, history, entitlements, objects, communications, and payments. So taking the concepts of the virtual world and adding all these other aspects of persistence and interoperability. So he's got a framework for the metaverse that I'll start to break down here in a little bit, but I wanted to take a step back and think about how I start to think about how all these things are tied together. So for me, a good ground is Lawrence Lessig's pathetic dot theory, which is just essentially a way of looking at how there's these collective things of the cultural norms, the law, the market dynamics, and the underlying technological architecture in the code. Now, I like to also think about it in terms of these nested contexts, where at the largest context, you have the earth, and then from the earth, you have the culture, which is within the context of the earth. In the context of the culture, you have the laws, and then the economy, then the design guidelines, and then the network architecture, XR hardware, operating system and code, and game engines, application code, and then finally the user experience. The user experience is where the magic happens once you have all these other larger contextual dimensions all coming together. So this creates a bit of a tech stack where you start to, for me at least, able to make sense of all these different components of the metaverse as different people are talking about it. So going back to Matthew Ball's framework of the metaverse, if you start to break that down, then you can see how it plays out here, everything from the economy all the way up to the apps and experiences. Matthew Ball is not necessarily thinking too much about the ethical framework. I think that's probably one of the reasons why Christopher Lafayette came up with focusing on some of those ethical aspects of the metaverse. Tony Parisi came forth with the 7 rules of the metaverse, essentially expanding on how we start to think about the open web, it being open and interoperable and decentralized control and all these different values. And also that it's hardware independent, that it's not tied to any specific technology and that it's for everyone. HEC has been talking a lot about ways of making sense of this shift from the 2D into the 3D. And so if we map that out, there's different aspects of the user experience and the apps that are being created, but also certainly the hardware that's going from 2D into the immersive worlds, and then also the economic aspects. Mark Zuckerberg is thankfully talking a lot about interoperability aspects of the metaverse, but also these are the different ways that Meta is thinking about the qualities of the metaverse. A lot of it's tied down to different hardware that they're creating, but the qualities of presence, feeling like you're in this other place. They're saying privacy and interoperability. I think they have their own definitions of what privacy means, but certainly moderation are going to be a huge concern when it comes to safe online spaces as well. There are some tenets from a Roblox metaverse, which you start to map out, and that is immersive, friends, identity, robust economic aspects. Microsoft is really focused on the network architecture layer. So Azure and all their backend services is what they're really emphasizing and focusing on. They have aspects of the HoloLens and AltSpace and Minecraft and all their consumer side, but for most of their public talk around the metaverse, it's mostly been enterprise focused. Niantic prefers AR over VR, and they call the metaverse a dystopian nightmare. They're creating a little bit of a false bifurcation of just because it's virtual doesn't mean that it's less valuable than something that's happening in the physical reality. But they're betting on the real world metaverse with augmented reality and creating things like Lightship AR APIs. You start to see how it maps out here. And then Jasmine Roberts is, from an engineering perspective, trying to break down a lot of the aspects of the engines, platforms, backend, protocols, all the different stuff that a developer would need to start to actually work with the metaverse across all these different tools that are made available. And then other folks like Swati Bhatia has a metaverse framework that is trying to cover all these different aspects. And then the XR Safety Initiative has the anatomy of the metaverse, which they start to pull in more ethics and laws and governance and the societal aspects. And Coinbase, talking about the cryptocurrency aspect, for me, there's a lot of speculation and hype that, is still to be determined as to whether or not the engineering flaws within the cryptocurrency is going to be overcome, making it more ecologically sustainable, or to prevent it from being overtaken by Sybil attacks. But they're trying to look at the economic layer and also aspects of the user experience and identity, and certainly need a lot of regulatory frameworks for it to be viable as well, to cut down on all the scams that are happening. Avi Bar-Zeev is talking a lot about the 7 verses and having the progression through many different layers, but looking across different qualities of presence and experiences. So there's a lot of spatial metaphors and avatars, people, artifacts, interaction, but privatization and monetization also a key factor. John Radoff's looking at different layers of interoperability for the metaverse that can be broken down like this. And then finally, the 7 standards of the metaverse from Christopher Lafayette is trying to pull in a lot of the things that were missing from the larger technological specifications of the metaverse and trying to look at from a human rights and diversity and inclusion, but also just making it accessible and other ethical aspects as well. So you can start to break it down in this way. I wanted to say a few words about the value of pluralism, because as I look at all these different frameworks, it's important to remember that the map is not the territory. So there's a lot of things that are missing. And another way that I like to think about it is analogies in philosophy of mathematics, where there's not a solid foundation for mathematics, and that it's possible that pluralism could be a philosophy of math, meaning that there's insufficient evidence to say that there's one single foundation that's going to be solid for all of mathematics, and that it should be taken seriously that it's possible that there may be several together inconsistent foundations for mathematics. And so in thinking about how that applies here, you can think of the metaphor of lots of people who are blindfolded on an elephant, and they each have a specific insight, but they also have other things being included from them. So each framework is revealing some information about something, but it's also concealing other things. So as I switch between all these different perspectives, then it's important to remember that. Obviously you can break out of that nested hierarchy and start to look at these individual entities. You can look at the phenomenological aspects of the context, quality, character, and story of an experience, and then the intersectional axes of privilege, domination, and oppression across groups that are oppressed or not oppressed, and looking at it through those lenses, which can reveal a lot of information that's being missed from any other perspective. And then different ethical frameworks of seeing how there's consequentialism and deontology and virtual ethics. Each of these are unique ways of how to think through some of these ethical and moral dilemmas. So let's talk about the experience economy and experiential design. When I think about the future of the metaverse, VR technologies is my center of gravity, and I feel like there is a lot of insight by breaking that down. So the experience economy, Pine and Gilmore talked about how we're moving from extracting commodities and making goods and services and moving into staging experiences. So experiences are things that unfold over time. So they're revealed over duration. They're more memorable, visceral, and stimulating all of your sensory experiences. So experience is the process of doing and seeing things or having things happen to you over time. And a quote that I like to think about is in the context of a story where you have a character that's being placed in these situations and characters being revealed in the choices that a human being makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the deeper the revelation, the truer the choice of the character's essential nature. So you're placed within a context, you're making choices and you're taking action, and there's some aspect of your essential character that's being revealed. That's in the process that's unfolding over time, or it can be in the context of a story. So to simplify that, you have the context, quality, character, and story. So just briefly, the quality, you have active presence, mental and social presence, emotional presence, and embodied and environmental presence. These are all different qualities of presence that are all happening all at the same time, are distinct affordances of immersive technologies. With the metaphor of video games, where you're expressing your agency, with mental and social presence when it comes to the internet, World Wide Web, and social media, you have the abstractions of language to be able to communicate with other people, but also to make sense of the world that it seems plausible, and you can suspend your disbelief to make it feel like whatever world that you're in feels like it makes sense. And then you have the emotional presence of building and releasing tension, film and television and lighting and music that's really engaging your emotions. And then the thing that's really new within virtual augmented reality is that you have this sense of embodied presence, that you're being into place and that you feel like you have an embodiment, and it's stimulating all of your sensory experiences so that you actually feel like you're there. So it's taking action, making choices, emotional immersion, and sensory experience. So each of the communication media, as we've progressed through oral storytelling and theater to books to film, radio, TV, video games, internet, mobile phone, and VR and AR, each of these are including the previous media and transcending and including different qualities and combining them in unique ways. And so with video games, as an example, you had new ways of expressing your agency. But with virtual and augmented reality, you have new ways of expressing your embodiment and sense of environmental presence within these virtual worlds. So that's the quality. The context, these are different contextual domains, which ends up being a really important concept that I'll be coming back to again and again. Looking at all the different domains of human experience, asking people what's the ultimate potential, their answer, education and entertainment, or hang out with your friends and family. The immersive quality of these technologies are able to recreate a lot of these different contextual domains. And given that, you have different ways of thinking about ethical and moral dilemmas within that context. So in 2019, I did a whole XR Ethics Manifesto, which was trying to map out the range of ethical and moral dilemmas across all these different industry verticals. Lawrence Lessig's pathetic dot theory is really handy to be able to start to think about all these different contextual domains, and whether that's in the nested context, which I talked about already, or the intersecting axes of privilege, domination, and oppression. So you have ableism and sexism and class bias and language bias and anti-Semitism and racism and genderism. So each of these have groups having more privilege, and then there's a domination aspect that has people that are oppressed in certain ways. And so with all these different technologies, what's important is to realize that they may be amplifying different aspects of oppression, especially if you're not including a diverse and inclusive range of folks within a design process. They may not see that they're creating these systems that are actually amplifying a lot of aspects of oppression. So it's really important to recognize that and to include people not only in the design process, but to really listen to folks who are in these underrepresented or marginalized communities, because they're going to be the early warning system to see some of the different gaps that you have within your architectures to make sure that these worlds really work for everybody. So that's the context. You have the story that's unfolding over time. So you have different ranges of making choices and authored narrative, generative narrative, and different structures of how that's organized, and a broad range of how they're able to handle that agency. So the character, just as you think about whose character is revealed within these immersive experiences, if you're watching other people in a story, that's their character that's being revealed. But if it's you in the experience, then it's parts of your character that could be revealed, meaning you're evolving or growing in different aspects of your character, or different feelings or needs that are being met in the phenomenological experiences and what it feels like. All right, so that's the context, quality, character, and story of ways of starting to think about experiential design. Now, let's move on to the XR privacy dilemmas and context and rights, because privacy ends up being a really interesting way of trying to tie all these things together. So when we think about XR technologies, a lot of ways that we think about existing privacy dilemmas is for the context of personally identifiable information, focusing on an individual identity. But within VR, there's a lot of new biometric information that's being radiated from our bodies, and it's all these inferences that are going to be made from that. So you have lots of different physiological and biometric data that's going to be made available. How do you make sense of this? Well, one way is to look at the taxonomy of brain data from contextual data and direct measures of neural function, or direct measures of your neural structure or function. Are there ways that we need to have new laws or regulations to make sure that this doesn't get out of control in terms of having technology that can literally read your mind? But the way I think about it through the lens of the active presence is your behaviors, intentions, actions, and movements, your mental and social presence, and your mental thoughts, cognitive processes, cognitive load, social presence. Emotional presence is your affective state, emotional sentiment, your facial expressions and micro-expressions, and then embodied presence of your stress arousal, physiological reactions, eye gaze and attention, body language, and muscle fatigue. So all of this information that's fused together is essentially painting a picture of what's happening inside of your body, inside of your mind, which is leading to these aspects of neurorights. So we need to protect our right to identity, so being able to be psychographically profiled, and then our right to mental privacy. So all these different things that are happening all tied together, really revealing what's happening inside of our mind. And then our right to agency, where these subtle nudges that once they have a map of all this, being able to undermine your ability to be able to take intentional actions without undue influence by people who have an asymmetrical amount of information of who you are, what you're interested in from moment to moment. So that's the proposed neurorights. Then there's a concept of biometric psychography, which needs to be defined within the law, and how to make sense of them from a legal perspective, since at this point they're not really covered in any of the laws. Helen Niesenbaum's ideas around contextual integrity is really important because you need to think about a lot of these things from a contextual perspective. So looking at how information that you may be sharing with a doctor is different than information you'd be sharing with a bank, and that it's not that you need to have an absolute stop from all this information from flowing, that information actually does need to flow, it just is contextually relevant. So how do you define those contexts and make sure that it's appropriate use or not appropriate use? That's the rub. So essentially you have the human rights that are feeding into, like as a soft law, into the governments and the laws. That's also feeding into the ethical design principles. The big aspect here is that the companies have a lot of leverage in terms of how this is all playing out, because they have not only the context of the hardware and the operating system, but all these user agreements in terms of service that's dictating what's going in and out of these different systems, and mediated technologies that are giving them access to these third-party experiences. So if you try to break down all the different aspects of privacy, it's really quite complicated. But the point here is just that there's a lot of ways in which there's a flow from the soft law into the law, and then that is shifting how the companies are changing and operating. But you can also look at privacy has a libertarian approach where privacy is a property right to be bought, sold, or traded, or contextual integrity is really looking at privacy as an appropriate flows of information that's meeting contextual norms, or a paternalistic approach is looking at privacy as human right that needs to be protected by the state. So looking at the concept of privacy as a right is something that's been popularized by GDPR and the rights of the data subject of all the different rights that are given. There's the neuro rights that I talked about, and then there's the 10 internet principles and digital rights that are being declared. Then there's the Barcelona Charter of Citizens' Rights in the digital era, and then the government of Spain passing the Charter of Digital Rights. So there's a lot of talk about these digital rights, but how do those actually get translated? When you have these human rights principles, you still need to go from the soft law into what the regional laws are. So there still needs to have this translation from these higher order concept of the rights and actually implement them and then be able to enforce them in some fashion. And so Daniel Solov talks a lot about the limitations of this approach of even if you do all these things of declaring these rights, you still have to specify from a legal perspective and then implement it from a technological perspective as well. So there's still a lot of gaps that he starts to map out here in this latest article. A relational theory of data governance is another thing of we're not just single entities, but there's a lot of information that is connected to us from a societal level, and it really needs to take a structural approach of a lot of this stuff, but also move beyond just thinking of us as the individual entities that are not in relationship to other people, because a lot of this information economy is about not only our connections with other people, but also there's a relational dimension to privacy as well that needs to be addressed. And Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy, for me, is a big inspiration for starting to map out some of these shifts from static concrete objects into thinking about things in terms of the process relational approaches. There's a towards data governance framework for brain data that is also similarly trying to map out different aspects of the soft law of the ethics and the human rights, but also the binding laws. And then from the innovation perspective of what the responsibilities are from the perspective of those companies. The last sections here, I wanted to talk a little bit about the challenges with the economic context here, where there's so many different aspects of how these tech companies are driving different aspects of the law and the culture. So ideally, you have the cultural norms and then the law, the market, and then the technological architecture, and then the user, and it's being driven by a democratic process. But what happens when you have an authoritarian government like in China, which is much more centralized authority in the laws, where the government can start to shape the culture based upon what is accepted or not accepted? And then you have the corporate approach where the market dynamics are actually shaping the laws of the country so that it ends up being those who are really wealthy really dictate the laws that are beneficial to them. And then the citizens don't have as much leverage there. And then the last layer, I think, which is I think where we're at now, is this more tech oligarchic level where you have the market dynamics of these big tech companies that have these architectures that then have these other feedback loops that are then shifting culture. So based upon the different algorithms that they're creating, it can have a network effect that scales out and goes viral and really shifts culture really, really quickly. So how do you start to deal with this? So when you look at Lessig's approach, there are all these independent entities, but if you were to weight them in terms of what's really powerful, you have the market dynamics that's much bigger than what's happening with either the cultural norms or the law. So this is kind of the reality of when we talk about this, then there's companies like Meta who are really unduly shaping the XR industry based upon their practices and decisions. Just as an example, trying to grow the VR industry purely through gaming. And so you have these user personas that each of them have a demographic balance between males and females and how much money they're spending. And so they came forth and said, okay, these three user personas of dedicated gamer, play to win gamer, and steady gamer is what developers should be focusing on and is what they've been curating within their story. The challenge that I wanted to point out is as you start to look at the different demographic distributions, the top three that they picked were 74% male, 74% male, and 63% male. So 2/3 to 3/4 male centered, with the other demographics being deprioritized and not really functionally served. So right off the bat, just by trying to quickly grow the VR market, has created these skewed demographics just based upon who they're specifically targeting from these different segments. So what does that mean when it comes to promoting diversity and inclusion and having things beyond this Ready Player One driven by gaming? So they're really focusing on these gamer archetypes. So what happens with these other intersectional identities that may be deprioritized? If this is something that's happening in the economic layer from Meta, this is something that is ultimately going to be up to a lot of what decisions they're making as a company. And people who are outside of that process just need to try to have their voice heard and be included within this process or curation, and even working within Meta itself to be able to help diversify who is making a lot of these decisions. So the last couple of things I wanted to cover here are responsible innovation and the tech pacing gap. So Meta has their own responsible innovation principles of never surprise people, controls that matter, consider everyone, put people first. They're really not industry best practices for responsible innovation outside of Meta's context. They kind of took that phrase and made it mean whatever they wanted to mean. Sally Applin and Catherine Flick did a whole deconstruction of Project Aria, looking at this research project they're doing with putting AR glasses onto employees and having them walk around in public and record everything 24/7 from egocentric data capture. There's a lot of things ethically that were problematic with it, and they analyzed things that should have raised some red flags and maybe even prevented this from happening. And they concluded that a lot of what they were doing was violating their own principles of responsible innovation. And so therefore they concluded that these responsible innovation principles are just being used to ethics wash something that's already being technologically determined to be what they want to do already. So there's lots of other resources when it comes to responsible innovation, from this Research and Innovation Commission that happened from Horizon 2020, from European Commission. There's principles of responsible innovation to step through different processes. There's frameworks and books that have been written about it. Another way of saying it is anticipate, reflect, engage, and act. So if you break down concepts of responsible innovation, you should be anticipating. So looking at things like the XR Ethics Manifesto, looking at these landscape of ethical and moral dilemmas. Meta themselves came up with this series of responsible innovation dimensions. So they've already started to map out some of these different contextual dimensions. They've been focusing on the principles rather than these contextual dimensions, but it's a key part of evaluating these different trade-offs of how to progress and make sure that you're not bringing undue harm for any of these different contextual domains. Again, looking at from an intersectional perspective, the IEEE is a project that I've been working on, putting forth a number of different white papers looking at medical XR, ethics and education, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and business and finance, and privacy, identity, and harassment and trolling to help anticipate a lot of these different ethical and moral dilemmas. XR Safety Initiative's been putting out a number of different reports, including just recently the XR risks and challenges that's worth taking a look at. And then reflecting, which is thinking about design thinking. What is it that you're really trying to do with the goals of why you're doing whatever you're doing within the immersive technologies? And then there's different aspects of engagement from a range from at the lowest level, non-participation and tokenism, at the highest level, citizen power. And so being able to engage with people beyond those lower rungs of non-participation, or just doing it to check off a checkbox, but to not really listen or not give any agency or power over the stakeholders who are the users or citizens. And I think as we move into responsible innovation, the goal is to start to be moving more and more up this ladder, where most of what we've been seeing is at the lower levels of tokenism or non-participation. And finally, stage gating innovation is trying to look at when we start to release different technologies out into the world, that it should go through these different phases. And if there's going to be a lot of issues, there should be a big giant red button that says, stop, don't deliver this. And so a lot of what Applin and Flick's critiques around Meta have been that there seem to be technologically determined, already inevitably happening. So whatever the responsible innovation frameworks that they have no agency to be able to stop something from being delivered. And that should be a fundamental aspect of what responsible innovation as a framework should be able to do. So the last thing I just wanted to point out is that there's a lot of different aspects of the calling ridge dilemma, which is that very early of the technology phase, there's this high degree of control, but then you still don't know what the challenges are going to be. Then it gets adopted, and then it's almost too late because it becomes so enmeshed into society. So you have the harmful social consequences of a fully developed technology can't be fully predicted to sufficient confidence to justify the imposition of controls. You don't want to regulate too early, as the saying goes. And then if you wait too long, then by the time it's sufficiently well developed and diffused for its unwanted social consequences to become apparent, then it's no longer easily controlled. And then it becomes too expensive. So it's basically too late. So this dialectic of the Calling Ridge dilemma, that in the end means that things never end up getting regulated because you don't want to do it too early. And then all of a sudden it becomes too late because it's diffused and too difficult to pull back once it's into the hands of users and it changes the behavior. And then there's the technology pacing gap, which is that the technology is developing so quickly that it's way above and beyond what the legal frameworks are able to even keep up with. So at the end, you have this growing gap between the pace of technology and the laws increasingly outdated in an effective legal structure to be able to regulate these emerging technologies. So the existing regulatory systems and ethical frameworks are inadequate to provide an effective, meaningful, and timely oversight of the current and future generations of emerging technologies. And in contrast, our traditional government oversight systems are mired in stagnation, ossification, and bureaucratic inertia, and seriously increasing and lagging behind the new technologies accelerating into the future. So this is an increasing problem as we move forward in overcoming the Calling Ridge dilemma as well as this technology pacing gap to see what are some of the issues like privacy that need to be addressed maybe preventively before we sleepwalking into dystopia. So that's just some ways that I start to think about some of the different aspects of we're really dealing with a lot of self-regulated XR ethics where the market is really dictating things, and that it's going to take us figuring out what some of those ethical design principles are going to be as we start to move forward with the technology. And that's just an overview of lots of different things, talking about this landscape and some of these different dilemmas. And hopefully that helped you to understand a little bit more of both the frameworks of the metaverse, but also some of the different challenges as we move forward. So again, my name's Kent Bai, and thanks for listening.